He bought the $1 shack because he had nowhere left to go. What he didn't know was that his dog would uncover the one secret the whole town had been terrified to face. And when Shadow scratched through the floor for the first time, Grant realized something chilling. The truth he'd been running from wasn't behind him, it was buried right beneath his feet. The river was the first thing Grant Holloway heard when he stepped out of the bus. Not the soft kind of river that whispered over stones, but the winter kind, cold, fast, and dragging wind along its surface like it resented everyone who lived near it. Pine River, Montana, wasn't a place people arrived at. It was where they ended up when they had nowhere else to go. Grant tightened his grip on his duffel bag. The leather handle was worn smooth from years of deployment, years of travel, years of running from the noise in his mind. His boots sank into the damp gravel as he made his way down the narrow road that hugged the water's edge. Behind him, Shadow trotted close, quiet but alert. The shepherd's black and tan coat shimmered with river mist. His ears twitched at every passing sound, every shifting branch, every far-off engine. Grant had seen men fall apart on their worst days. Shadow had been the one who kept him from becoming one of them. Ahead stood the tiny wooden house, barely 8 steps across. A crooked roof, a sagging porch, and peeling white paint that had long surrendered to Montana weather. It overlooked the river like it was waiting for the water to swallow it whole. $1. That was the official price the county listed. A joke to the locals. A last chance to Grant. The first voice reached him before he even got to the steps. A pair of teenage boys leaned against their truck, sipping sodas like it was a front-row seat to the town's favorite show. There he is, the Dollar House hero. This is going to be good. Another snorted. Bet he won't last a week. Guy looks like he talks to walls. Maybe the dog's the smart one. Grant kept walking. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. Shadow did. The dog slowed, gaze locked onto the boys with a steady threat that didn't require teeth or raised hackles. Just presence. A soldier recognizing a target. The boys flinched and looked away. Shadow stayed close to Grant's leg until they reached the porch. One of the steps cracked under Grant's weight. The house groaned like it didn't want to be touched. Inside, the single room smelled of wet wood and long winters. A rusted stove stood in one corner. A crooked window tried to hold back the river wind. The space was small, but it was his. After months of living out of a truck, months sleeping under fluorescent shelter lights, this felt almost like a beginning. Grant dropped his bag. The thud echoed more loudly than it should have. Shadow didn't move farther in. Instead, he circled the room once, nose low, breath steady. Then he froze near the center. Grant frowned. "What is it, boy?" Shadow pressed a paw against one of the floorboards. Not scratching. Testing. Grant stepped closer. The board didn't look different, but Shadow's body language said everything. Rigid. Focused. Waiting. Grant tapped the wood lightly with his knuckle. Hollow. The rest of the floor had offered dull thuds. This one rang sharper, a faint metallic sound beneath the grain. It was like tapping the lid of a steel box. Grant looked around the tiny room. Nothing else moved. Nothing else breathed except the dog. Shadow let out a low rumble, more warning than growl. He backed away from the board but didn't take his eyes off it. Grant crouched. His pulse picked up, not from fear but from something he hadn't felt in months. Instinct. The kind that kept you alive overseas. The kind that told you when something was wrong before you had proof. He leaned his weight on the board. It didn't budge. But when Shadow nudged it with his snout, there was a faint click beneath the wood, soft enough to miss unless you were listening for it. Grant straightened. That wasn't settling lumber. That wasn't age. That was machinery. A sound cut through the room, distant footsteps on gravel outside. Slow, deliberate. Grant stiffened. Shadow turned instantly, placing himself between Grant and the door, hackles barely lifted. The steps stopped right at the porch. Grant waited. The air felt colder than it had a moment ago. Someone exhaled on the other side of the door. Shadow held perfectly still, muscles coiled. Then the footsteps moved away. 1, 2, 3, fading toward the riverbank. Grant moved to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. The river glimmered in the dying light. No silhouette, no stranger, just the sound of water rushing past. When he turned back, Shadow had returned to the same spot on the floor, pressing his paw there again, more insistent this time. Grant stepped closer and whispered, more to himself than to the dog, "What did they leave under here?" The wind shoved against the window. The boards creaked in reply. Shadow stayed planted there for the rest of the night, refusing sleep, his eyes never leaving the hollow sound beneath the floor. Something was waiting in this house. Something Shadow had sensed the moment they walked through the door. Grant lay back on the old cot he'd dragged inside. He knew enough to trust a dog who'd smelled danger long before any human could. Shadow didn't sleep, and neither did the house. Grant woke before the sun, breath ragged, shirt damp with cold sweat. The dream had taken him back again. Back to the alley thick with dust and burning metal. Back to the radio static that never stopped. Back to the moment Captain Doyle disappeared behind a collapsing wall. He sat upright, gripping the edge of the cot until the shaking in his hands slowed. Shadow lifted his head from the floor, ears forward, watching him closely. The dog didn't need words. He moved closer, pressing his shoulder against Grant's leg. That simple weight kept Grant from slipping too far into the memory. "I'm fine," Grant whispered, though the words felt unconvincing even to him. Outside, Pine River was waking up. A truck rolled past on the gravel, slowing just enough for the driver to get a good look at the little house and the man in front of it. Someone muttered something through an open window. Another neighbor across the way stood on her porch, arms folded, shaking her head like she pitied him or feared him. Grant wasn't sure which. He stepped outside to catch fresh air, Shadow following close. Word traveled fast in small towns. By now, everyone knew about the $1 veteran who bought the river shack. They knew his past, or thought they did. Enough rumors to keep distance between him and everyone else. As he walked toward the small general store, 2 men smoking by the door stopped talking the second they saw him. One elbowed the other. "That the guy? The one with the dog and the issues?" Grant ignored them, or tried to, but the voices dug under his skin the same way shrapnel once had. Shadow stayed fixed at his heel, his gaze sharp, reading Grant's breathing, his posture, even the subtle tightening around his jaw. On the walk back, Grant felt relief at leaving the town noise behind. But when they reached the foot of the tiny house, Shadow froze. His entire body stiffened. He stared through the half-open door with a suspicion that seemed too focused for a simple, abandoned shack. Inside, the air felt colder than it had an hour earlier. Shadow went straight to the same spot on the floor from the previous night, nose pressed low, inhaling deeply. He didn't bark, not fully. Just a low, quick sound from his throat. A warning, a request for Grant to pay attention. Grant crouched beside him. Shadow's head jerked slightly at a small, sharp sound beneath the floor, like a gear resetting after years of sleep. Grant leaned closer. There it was again. A clean metallic click, faint but unmistakable. Grant tapped the floorboard. The hollow ring felt even more out of place now. Shadow circled once, then sat facing the far wall, ears pinned back. Grant frowned. What is it? Something in the wall? Shadow moved slowly toward the right corner of the room and pressed his snout against the vertical paneling. He inhaled sharply, stepped back. then emitted a soft huff of unease. Grant placed his hand on the wall. The wood felt cold, far colder than the rest of the house. He pushed gently. Something inside shifted. Not much, but enough to send a shiver up the frame. A sound followed, a dry metallic snap, like a rusted hinge waking up. Grant stepped back quickly. Shadow stood between him and the wall now, posture tight, the same stance he used overseas when he sensed an explosive device. A memory flashed across Grant's mind. Not a nightmare, but a moment from training. A sergeant teaching them how old safe houses hid their secrets behind double walls, hollow spaces, false panels. Grant looked at the corner again. Behind that wall, something had just unlocked itself. Outside, wind scraped along the siding. The river rushed louder, as if warning them to listen closer. Shadow moved to Grant's side, eyes fixed on the wall. Grant could feel the dog's heartbeat through his shoulder. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. Then the sound came again. A single sharp, metallic knock from inside the wall. Not settling wood, not animals. It was too deliberate, too clean. Grant's skin prickled. The house wasn't just old and falling apart. It was holding something, protecting something, or hiding it. A louder thump echoed from behind the wall, sudden enough for Grant to step back instinctively. Shadow lunged forward, barking once, low and forceful. Grant's pulse shot through him. For a moment he thought someone was inside, someone trying to break into the house from the inside out. But no footsteps followed, no voices, just the long, heavy silence that comes after a secret shifts in the dark. Then an unexpected twist. Outside, gravel crunched. Someone was approaching. Grant moved to the window. A woman he hadn't met before walked along the path carrying a basket. Her eyes drifted to the house, then to the river, then back to the house again. She paused as if she sensed the tension radiating from inside. Shadow stayed rigid, watching the door, not the window. Eyes fixed like he knew the sound wasn't from outside at all. Grant whispered, almost to himself, "This place is wrong." He knelt down and placed a hand on Shadow's neck. The dog didn't look away from the wall. There was something here, something man-made, something hidden so long that the slightest touch had set its old mechanisms stirring. Grant exhaled slowly. He had survived war zones, but the quiet in this house felt more dangerous than any battlefield he'd walked. Shadow finally looked at him, and Grant understood the message in the dog's eyes. The river house wasn't empty. It was waiting for the right person to open what it had been guarding, and Shadow, loyal and unyielding, had already chosen that person. The morning wind came sharp off the river, cold enough to sting. Grant climbed onto the sagging roof with a hammer, a handful of nails, and an old tarp he found in the shed out back. The roof creaked under his weight, threatening to give way any second. He moved slowly, testing each plank before trusting it with his knee. Shadow patrolled below, pacing the gravel like a sentry guarding a forward outpost. His ears flicked at every passing sound, every snap of wind, every distant truck. Grant had just started securing the tarp when an engine slowed on the road. Voices. Laughter. He didn't need to look to know they were talking about him. There he is, the Dollar House Marine. Get a shot of that. A phone camera pointed upward. Another laugh burst out, sharp and mocking. "Man, this is gold! He's actually trying to fix that thing." Grant kept his head down. Breathe. Ignore it. Stay steady. But the words worked their way under his skin the way dirt slips under a bandage. Shadow growled, low and warning. He planted himself between the house and the group, turning his body sideways in a protective stance he'd used in active zones. One of the men laughed harder. "Look at that. The dog's doing more thinking than he is." Grant's jaw tightened. He climbed down before anger could outrun reason. By the time his boots hit the ground, the truck peeled away, spraying dust across the yard. Shadow pressed against his leg, grounding him again. Grant put a hand on the dog's neck. "I know, I'm fine." But Shadow wasn't focused on the road anymore. He sniffed the air once, then trotted inside the tiny house with purpose, tail high, posture alert. Grant followed. The air inside felt different, heavy, still. Shadow didn't waste a second. He went straight to the same floorboard that had clicked the night before, but this time he didn't stop there. He dug his paws into the wood, scratching hard, not in panic but in determination. Grant hurried over. Shadow's claws raked the floor in deliberate arcs until the wood splintered slightly near the edge. Dust puffed up into the air. Shadow stepped back and looked at Grant. "Show me, boy." Grant knelt down. The board looked normal at first glance, but now that Shadow had scraped away some grime, a thin, unnatural line appeared where the wood grain should have been seamless. Grant ran a thumb along it. Perfectly straight. Too straight. Shadow let out a short bark, urging him on. Grant pressed where Shadow had been scraping. Nothing. He shifted his hand slightly and pressed again, closer to the far corner. A soft click answered. Grant jerked back as the board shifted sideways, gliding half an inch under his palm as if someone had installed it on a hidden rail. Shadow lowered his head, watching with absolute focus. Grant gripped the edge of the board and pushed. It slid with a low, smooth scrape, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. Cold air drifted upward, untouched by daylight. Grant angled himself to see better, and froze. Under the floorboard wasn't dirt or insulation. It was metal. A flat, steel surface stretched beneath the floor, the color dulled by age but unmistakably crafted. It looked like the top of a safe or a hatch, flush with the base, marked by a tiny circular keyhole and a faded serial number etched near the corner. Grant's pulse hammered in his ears. His breath fogged in the cold air. Shadow stepped to the edge of the opening, snout hovering an inch above the metal, breathing it in. He didn't growl this time. Instead, he let out a low, steady whine, the kind he used when he found something important overseas. Something buried, something dangerous. Grant whispered, "That's impossible." He looked at the surrounding boards. None of them were loose. None of them shifted. This one, the one Shadow had found, was the only piece built to move. Grant pressed his palm against the metal plate. It was ice cold, far colder than the room. That alone told him it wasn't just some old storage box. The cold was the kind that came from deep insulation, sealed space, steel that hadn't been exposed to air or light in years. What the hell is this place? Shadow nudged his elbow, a firm push, as if telling him to keep going, to finish what he started. But something about the air felt wrong now. Too still. Too heavy. Grant's instincts tightened in his chest, the way they used to before an ambush. The tiny house was silent for a breath. Then a sound came from the wall again. A faint pop, like a latch releasing somewhere deeper inside the structure. Grant spun around, flashlight ready, heart racing. Shadow bristled, stepping in front of him, body angled towards the right side of the room. Silence returned, but nothing felt calm. Grant looked back at the metal plate, the safe, the hatch. Whatever it was, it had been hidden intentionally, built into the house decades ago, long before the place had rotted into a joke. Shadow waited, eyes fierce, unwavering. Grant swallowed hard, fingers lingering near the edge of the steel. Something inside that safe had woken the moment he touched the floorboard. Whatever was down there, it wasn't meant to be forgotten. Grant took one step back. "Not yet, boy." Shadow looked up, confused, but Grant shook his head. Not alone. Not without knowing who's been watching this place. The river wind rattled the window. The cold metal beneath the floor stared back at him, patient, silent, full of secrets. Shadow didn't move from the opening. He knew the truth was sitting right there, inches away, and he knew Grant wasn't ready to open it yet. The house settled with a long, low creak, as if something underneath was shifting again. Waiting. Night fell hard over Pine River, the kind of night where the cold ate through bone and the sky felt too heavy for stars. Grant sat on the edge of the cot, boots still on, staring at the sliver of moonlight cutting through the crooked window. He wasn't ready to sleep. He wasn't sure he could. Shadow wasn't resting either. The dog paced the small room with deliberate steps, nose low, tail stiff. Every few passes he nudged Grant's leg, then returned to that floorboard as if reminding him of what lay beneath. When Shadow finally pressed his forehead against Grant's knee and let out a sharp huff, Grant exhaled in defeat. "All right, show me." Shadow led him straight to the exposed opening. The board Grant had slid earlier was still shifted, leaving a narrow rectangle that breathed cold air into the tiny house. Grant grabbed the flashlight from his pack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust, landing on the metal plate. This time he looked closer, leaning in until his breath fogged just above the steel. It wasn't just a hatch. It was a Cold War-era floor safe. Thick steel, reinforced edges, mechanical lock dial worn smooth from age but still functional. A serial number, barely visible through grime, traced along the top corner. It wasn't random. It wasn't homemade. It was government-issued. Military grade. Grant's stomach tightened. He knew the feel of these things. He'd cracked open enough abandoned bunkers overseas to recognize one from a glance. Shadow stood beside him, body angled protectively, but his eyes stayed fixed on the safe. He understood what this meant without needing the words. There was something inside, and someone had put it here on purpose. Grant traced the serial number with his thumb, the cold stinging his skin. Why hide a military safe under a $1 shack on the river? Why bury it so deep no one would ever stumble across it? Unless it wasn't meant to be found, unless it was meant to be kept quiet. Grant's breath fogged again. The house creaked, not the usual settling. A slow, deliberate shift like old tension rising from the walls. Shadow's ears shot up. Grant froze. Footsteps. Soft, controlled, moving along the outside porch. Not hurried, not clumsy. Someone walking with purpose. Someone who didn't want to be heard. Shadow moved without hesitation. He stepped in front of Grant, positioning himself between his handler and the door. His growl started low in his chest, steady and dangerous. A sound he used overseas when he sensed hostile intent. Grant's heart thudded against his ribs. He turned off the flashlight, plunging the house into near darkness. Only a sliver of moonlight seeped through the window. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Grant held his breath. Shadow didn't. His growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the small space. The dog planted his paws firmly, ready to spring. A slow scrape touched the doorknob. Metal against metal. Someone was testing it, someone who didn't want to knock. Grant grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the stove, gripping it tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Another scrape. Then a faint exhale from the other side of the wood. Shadow bared his teeth. Grant whispered, barely audible, "Not tonight." The footsteps retreated, moving off the porch. Slow, cautious. They didn't run. They walked away like they were sure they'd be back. Grant waited until the last trace of sound faded into river wind. A few long seconds passed before he let out the breath he had been holding. Shadow stayed alert, but his body eased slightly now that the danger had passed. Grant knelt beside him. "Good boy. You heard him before I did." Shadow nudged him back toward the open floorboard, eyes sharp, insistent. The message was clear. They were being watched, and the longer they waited, the more danger would come. Grant lit the flashlight again, its beam bright in the darkness. He moved closer to the safe, fingers brushing the lock dial. His pulse hammered, his instincts screamed caution. But Shadow stood right beside him, steady as a rock, breathing slow, a reminder that they had walked into worse darkness together. Grant placed his hand firmly on the dial. The metal burned cold against his fingertips. He hesitated only a moment. The house thudded softly again, as if something inside the walls shifted in anticipation. Grant whispered, "Here we go, boy." Then he turned the dial. The first click echoed like a gunshot. Shadow stood perfectly still, watching the safe as though he knew the truth beneath the floor was finally, inevitably, waking. Grant turned the dial again. Another click. The safe door gave a faint twitch, loosening from decades of silence. Grant swallowed hard. Whatever secrets lived under this tiny river house were no longer hidden. And for the first time, Grant realized he wasn't just uncovering someone else's past. He was stepping into a story that had been waiting for him long before he ever arrived in Pine River. The final turn of the dial snapped into place with a heavy mechanical clunk. Grant felt the shift through his fingertips, the way you feel the moment a locked door finally gives up its resistance. He pulled the handle. The steel groaned, stiff from years of silence, then opened an inch. Cold air leaked out, sharper than anything in the room. Shadow stepped forward, nose nearly touching the gap, breathing deeply. His muscles stayed tight, his body angled protectively toward Grant. Grant braced himself and pulled the door open all the way. Inside, the safe was deeper than he expected. Much deeper. A hidden compartment built with military precision, insulated, preserved. He shone the flashlight into the cavity. 4 items lay inside. The first was a stack of sealed military files wrapped in waterproof casing. The paper edges were crisp, not yellowed. Someone had placed them here carefully, intentionally, making sure they would survive time. The second item was a folded map, thick paper, marked with red grease pencil lines. Grant recognized the area immediately. The forest north of Pine River. The same places locals whispered about late at night. The same areas supposedly restricted years ago for reasons no one could explain. The third item made his breath stop. A military ID badge. Name: Captain Elias Doyle. Service branch: United States Army status. Missing. The edges of the badge were scratched, as if someone had tried to remove it from its lanyard in a hurry. The plastic was cracked. Mud still clung to the bottom corner, frozen in time. Grant stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening. Doyle wasn't just a superior officer. He had been the leader who walked point, the steady voice in the worst firefights, the man who had hauled Grant out of a collapsed building on the last mission they ever ran together. And then Doyle vanished. No remains, no message, gone like smoke. Grant had lived years thinking Doyle was dead, killed in the same disaster that took half their unit. Shadow nudged the badge with the tip of his nose, then looked up at Grant with soft, questioning eyes. Grant whispered, "Doyle, you were here. You were really here." The fourth object waited in the back of the safe, a small black cassette tape. No label, no markings, just a strip of worn, dark plastic with a crack near the corner, held together by electrical tape. Grant lifted it with both hands, as though it might crumble apart. His fingers trembled. A message, or a confession, or something far worse. Shadow inhaled sharply beside him. His body jerked once, like he'd caught an unfamiliar scent. Then his ears shot back and a low whine escaped him. Not fear. Something closer to recognition mixed with distrust. Grant whispered, "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't look at the tape. Instead, he moved toward the stack of files. He pressed his nose against the sealed documents, sniffed once, twice, then stepped back fast, tail stiff, head lowered. Grant had seen that reaction before. Overseas, when explosives or foreign chemicals were nearby, when a battlefield had recently been walked by someone who meant harm. Shadow gave a sharp bark, low and forceful, then looked at the door as if expecting someone to be standing there. Grant frowned. Someone touched this. Recently, the idea hit him like a slap. The house had been abandoned for decades, but these files were not old, not untouched. The edges showed the faint oil imprint of fingers. Shadow wouldn't react unless there was a fresh scent. A human scent. Someone had opened this safe before Grant ever set foot in the river house. Someone had put these items back inside, or taken something out. Grant reached into the safe again, searching the bottom, running his flashlight across every inch. There were faint scratches on the steel interior. Not natural aging. Scrapes from something metal. Something removed. Grant's pulse pounded. He looked at the documents again. At the map. At Doyle's ID. No, someone didn't just hide this. Someone curated it, left a trail, a message, a warning. Shadow suddenly stiffened and pointed his nose toward the front door. A soft growl rolled from him, deep as thunder. His fur lifted along his spine. Grant killed the flashlight instantly. The room fell into darkness. Outside, gravel shifted under a slow, deliberate boot. Grant froze. Shadow lowered into a crouch, silent, ready. Another footstep. Someone was walking not down the road this time, but around the side of the house, moving with care. Too careful for a stranger, too practiced for a wanderer. Grant's hand tightened around the cassette tape, fingers pressing into the plastic. Whoever had visited this safe before might have come back for the rest. Shadow growled again, louder now, his stance protective, fearless. Grant mouthed, "Stay with me!" The footsteps stopped right outside the window. Grant didn't breathe. Shadow didn't blink. A long, tense silence followed. Then the sound of retreating footsteps. Slow, calm. Like the person outside wasn't running. Because they weren't afraid. They would be back. Grant lit the flashlight again only after the night finally settled. The safe door still hung open, the metallic smell of old air drifting into the room. He looked down at the items inside. His past, his dead commanding officer, a hidden map of a restricted forest, a tape that might explain everything or nothing at all. Shadow pressed his head against Grant's shoulder. Grant whispered, "Someone wanted me to find this, and someone else really didn't." Shadow's tail didn't move. He stayed on alert. Grant lifted Doyle's ID badge again, running his thumb across the cracked surface. For the first time since arriving in Pine River, he understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't an abandoned shack. It was a vault, a secret buried beneath dust and river wind. And someone alive wanted that secret to stay buried. Grant closed the safe and locked it again, his hands steady now. He wasn't walking away. Not anymore. The attack came without warning. Sometime after midnight, the river wind slammed against the house so hard it rattled the window frames. Grant lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying Doyle's ID badge in his mind. Shadow slept on the floor beside him, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Then the sound hit. A heavy boot on the porch. Shadow jerked awake instantly. Another step. Faster, closer. Shadow growled, deep and vicious, before Grant even sat up. The door exploded inward. A man in a dark jacket and military-grade boots charged through the threshold, moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to breach a space. His face was covered, his stance was tactical. Shadow launched at him without hesitation. The intruder kicked out with brutal force. The impact cracked through the room like a gunshot. Shadow's body hit the floor hard and skidded against the boards. A whine of pain tore out of him. Grant saw red. He rushed the attacker, slamming him into the wall. The man swung back, landing a punch to Grant's ribs, sharp and practiced. Grant countered with an elbow strike, forcing the man to stumble into the table. The intruder reached for something at his waistband. Grant didn't let him finish. He tackled the man again, smashing him to the ground. The two rolled across the floor, each blow harder than the last, grunts mixing with the sound of boots scraping against wood. The man twisted out from under him and bolted for the open door. Grant lunged after him, but a flare of pain shot up his side where the punch had landed. He staggered. Shadow tried to rise, but his front leg buckled. He let out a sharp, trembling whine. The intruder glanced back once, just enough for the porch light to catch the edge of his face mask. Then he sprinted into the darkness, disappearing into the tree line beside the river. Grant didn't chase. Not when Shadow lay injured. He dropped to his knees beside the dog. "Easy, boy. I've got you." Shadow pressed his head into Grant's palm, but the tremor in his body betrayed the pain. The kick had been deliberate, the kind meant to disable, to warn. Grant's breath shook with anger. No one touched his dog. Not again. Once Shadow steadied, Grant bandaged the dog's shoulder as best he could, then secured the door with a length of rope and a heavy chair. Only then did he return to the safe. The tape sat on the table under the beam of the flashlight. Grant grabbed the old cassette player he'd found in a box near the stove. He slid the tape in with fingers that still trembled. He pressed play. For a moment there was only static. Then Doyle's voice broke through. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it out." Grant's heart dropped. Shadow lifted his head at the voice, ears twitching. "Our unit wasn't ambushed by chance. We were sold out." Grant froze. Doyle continued, his voice strained, as if recorded while injured. "Someone on the inside gave our coordinates. Someone we trusted. Someone high enough to access classified routes." Static burst across the recording, then settled again. "They said he died during the mission. They lied. He's alive. Right there, in Pine River." Grant closed his eyes. The house suddenly felt too small, too cold. He lives like nothing happened, like he didn't send half the unit to die. Shadow whined softly, sensing the shift in Grant's breathing. Doyle's voice hardened. "If they find this tape, they'll destroy it. They'll bury the truth again. I hid the documents in the safe. I locked everything away for the right person. Someone who wouldn't run from the truth. Someone who was there." Grant swallowed, throat tight. Doyle's final words came out like a plea. "Find him. Expose him. Don't let our brothers be forgotten." The tape clicked off. Grant sat motionless for a long time. The silence pressed against him. The truth burned through him like fire. Someone from their mission. Someone declared dead, living in Pine River, watching the house, watching Grant. Shadow let out a soft, pained sound and leaned against him. Grant set the tape down gently. He placed a hand on Shadow's head, fingers sinking into the dog's warm fur. "I promise you," he whispered. "Nobody touches you again. Not him. Not anyone." Shadow blinked slowly, but his eyes stayed sharp. Grant looked toward the dark window. Now he knew the truth, and he knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Grant barely slept after the attack. He checked Shadow every hour, making sure the dog's breathing stayed steady, that the bruising didn't worsen. Dawn came cold and pale over the river, turning the windows a soft grey. The house still smelled of dust, adrenaline, and fear. But the air held something else, too. Resolve. Grant sat at the worn table, spreading the contents from the safe into neat rows. Doyle's sealed files, the map, the ID, the tape. He went through each detail slowly, reading until the lines blurred. Every clue pointed the same direction. A man with specialized training. Someone who moved silently, efficiently, like he'd been doing it his whole life. Someone who knew how to break into a house without being seen. Someone who had access to classified routes back then. And someone who had the influence to bury a military investigation. Only one name in Pine River fit the pattern. Sheriff Lucas Boone. Grant stared at the man's signature on a decades-old authorization form. His pulse tightened. Boone wasn't just involved. He had signed off on the operation that wiped out half their unit. Signed off on the route switch. Signed off on the lie. Grant whispered the name. Boone. Shadow stirred on the floor, lifting his head. Even injured, the dog seemed alert, watching his every move. Right then, a knock rattled the door. Grant stiffened. Shadow growled low, warning him before the second knock came. Grant closed the safe, kicked the rug back over it, and moved towards the door with caution. When he opened it, Sheriff Boone stood on the porch. Hat low, badge glinting, hands resting casually at his belt. But his eyes were anything but casual. "Morning, Holloway," Boone said. "Heard there was some kind of disturbance last night." Grant held the man's gaze. "You heard right." Boone stepped inside without waiting. His boots crossed the threshold easily, like he'd done it before. Grant's stomach twisted. He had. Boone's gaze swept the room with slow calculation. He didn't look at Grant. He looked at the corners, the walls, the floorboards. Evaluating. Searching. Shadow pushed himself upright, though the movement hurt him. His fur bristled. A deep growl rolled from his chest, harsher than the one he'd given the intruder. Boone didn't flinch. He only smirked. That dog's got spirit. Grant stepped between them. He remembered the boot prints from last night, the fighting stance, the precision. He saw it again now in Boone's posture, the way he shifted weight slightly on the balls of his feet. Grant recognized the training. Special forces. Exactly what Doyle had written in the file. "You don't seem surprised someone broke in," Grant said carefully. Boone shrugged. "This is a rough town. Folks around here aren't fond of outsiders." Shadow barked sharply, cutting him off. His eyes locked onto Boone's leg. Grant saw why. Shadow recognized the scent. Grant's pulse dropped like a stone. Boone gave a thin smile. "Funny dog. Looks like he's met me before." Grant didn't move. Neither did Shadow. Boone stepped closer, eyes darting to the rug near the safe. He paused just long enough for Grant to notice. Then he forced his gaze away, pretending disinterest. Pretending. It was confirmation. Boone knew. "You've been having trouble since you got here," Boone said. "People talking. Saying you've been seeing things, hearing things. With your record, son, that concerns me." Grant's jaw tightened. "My record doesn't give you the right to step into my house uninvited." Boone raised his eyebrows. "That a threat?" Shadow barked again, a sharp, cutting sound that filled the cabin. The dog pushed forward, teeth bared, ignoring the pain in his ribs. Grant held him back gently. Grant said quietly, evenly, "Shadow doesn't growl at shadows. Only at people who've hurt him." For the first time, Boone's facade cracked. Only for a second, but enough. Enough for Grant to see the truth in his eyes. Recognition, fear, and resentment. Boone adjusted his belt, stepping back toward the door. "Just checking on you. If anything else happens, you let me know." He walked out slowly, but Grant noticed how carefully he placed each step, how silent he tried to move, how he never turned his back fully. When the cruiser finally rolled down the hill, Grant shut the door and leaned against it, heart hammering. Shadow limped to him and pressed his head against Grant's knee. Grant knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "You knew, didn't you?" Shadow's breathing trembled, but his gaze stayed fixed on the direction Boone had gone. Grant whispered, "That was him. The one who kicked you. The one who tried to wipe out Doyle. The one who wants this truth buried." Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl. Grant looked at the rug covering the safe. This was it. Boone wasn't just a name in a file. He was the traitor. The man who sold out his unit. The man who killed Doyle. The man who came to finish the job last night. And he was the sheriff of Pine River. Grant exhaled slowly. His fear wasn't gone, but something else took its place. Determination. The past hadn't just followed him here. It lived here, and he was done running from it. By midday, the sky over Pine River turned a hard, washed-out blue, the kind that made the whole town feel exposed. Word had spread fast. Too fast. By the time Grant reached the riverbank clearing behind the diner, nearly half the town had gathered. Some curious, some judgmental, some whispering that the veteran had finally snapped. Grant didn't care. He carried Doyle's file in one arm, the cassette player in the other. Shadow limped beside him, ribs still sore but posture unbroken. The dog refused to stay behind. People parted as Grant approached, not out of respect, but out of unease. He could hear the murmurs. That the guy with the dollar house? Heard he picked a fight with someone last night. That dog looks injured. Maybe he hurt it. Grant ignored all of it. He reached the center of the clearing and set the folder and the tape recorder on a flat boulder near the river. The rushing water filled the silence for a long moment. Then the last person he wanted to see arrived. Sheriff Boone pushed through the crowd, face hard, jaw locked, badge gleaming in the sun. The conversations died instantly. "Holloway," Boone said, voice flat. "You want to tell me why you're dragging the whole damn town into your troubles?" Grant faced him, steady. "Because the truth isn't a trouble, it's a debt." Boone scoffed and looked at the crowd. "Folks, I'm sorry you were dragged out here for whatever this is, but Holloway's been having issues since he arrived. PTSD, hallucinations, you know how it is. I'm here to get this under control." Shadow growled low, stepping forward, even with his limp. His bark cut across the river wind like a warning shot. Grant placed a hand on Shadow's head, grounding the dog without holding him back. "This isn't about PTSD," Grant said. "It's about betrayal." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Boone folded his arms, bored, waiting for the moment to dismiss everything. Grant opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It trembled only slightly in his hand. "This is a sealed military log from Operation Haven 6, Doyle's operation, the one half our unit never walked away from." Gasps. Pine River was small, but it respected uniforms, even ones folded away for decades. Boone chuckled. "Old paperwork? That's what this is about? Holloway, you need rest." Grant picked up the cassette recorder. "No, you need to listen." Before Boone could react, Grant pressed play. Static hissed. Then Doyle's voice cut through the clearing, raw and unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, I didn't make it out. The mission was sabotaged. Someone fed our position to the enemy. Someone wearing the same uniform we trusted." Every head in the crowd turned toward Boone. Boone's jaw flexed. "Turn that off." Grant didn't. Doyle's voice grew sharper. "The traitor didn't die. He's alive, living in Pine River. Sheriff Boone." The name echoed across the river like a hammer blow. Boone's face drained of color. Then rage filled the empty space. He lunged. Grant barely braced before Boone slammed into him, fingers reaching for the tape, the files, anything he could destroy. The recorder fell to the ground. Papers scattered across the dirt. Grant fought back, but Boone moved like a man trained to end battles fast. He shoved Grant hard, driving him backward. Someone in the crowd screamed. Shadow moved first. The dog launched with all the strength he still had, teeth bared, body low and fast. He collided with Boone's leg, knocking the sheriff off balance. Boone stumbled and crashed onto the dirt. Shadow stood over Grant and snarled, ribs screaming but spirit unbroken. Boone tried to push himself up, but Shadow snapped his jaw inches from the sheriff's arm, stopping him cold. The crowd gasped. No one could mistake what they were seeing now. Truth, pure and undeniable. Grant rose, breathing hard. He looked at the cluster of townsfolk staring in shock. Megan Pierce had her phone out, recording the entire confrontation. Earl Matz, the loudest doubter, looked pale as chalk. Mrs. Kent covered her mouth with trembling hands. Grant gathered the documents Boone had tried to tear from him. His voice stayed steady. This is the file Doyle left. These are the coordinates Boone changed. These are the signatures he forged. Doyle spent his last days trying to expose him. Someone whispered, "My God." Another said, "Boone, after all these years." Boone's face twisted. "You idiots! This man is unstable. You're going to take his word over mine?" Megan stepped forward. That wasn't Grant's voice on the tape. That was Doyle naming you. She held up her phone, the video still recording. Boone looked from face to face, realizing the tide had turned. His power, built on 20 years of fear and reputation, was slipping through his fingers. He stood, dusting himself off, eyes burning with something feral. This town doesn't understand the kind of decisions men like us have to make. Doyle wasn't a hero. He was a threat. I did what I had to. Grant stared at him. No, you did what benefited you, and you left your brothers to die. Shadow growled again, inching forward, ready if Boone made another move. For a brief moment, the sheriff looked like he might attack again. But the crowd shifted. People stepped closer to Grant, not Boone, a protective circle forming around the man they once mocked. Boone saw it. He saw his control fading. And for the first time, Sheriff Lucas Boone looked afraid. Grant lifted the folder high enough for all to see. This is the truth. And today, Pine River finally hears it. Shadow pressed against his leg, guarding him as the river wind carried Doyle's voice into the silence. The traitor is among you. Now the whole town knew exactly who that was. The agents arrived before sunrise. 2 black SUVs rolled quietly down the dirt road along Pine River, tires crunching over frozen gravel. The town was still half asleep, smoke rising from chimneys, porch lights flickering on one by one as people peeked outside. Grant stood on the porch of the tiny house, Shadow leaning against his leg for support. The dog was still stiff from the injury, but his eyes were bright, alert, steady. The SUVs stopped. 4 agents stepped out, jackets marked in bold white letters. FBI. Sheriff Lucas Boone stumbled out of his house across the road before anyone knocked. His shirt was half-buttoned, breath fogging the air. He froze when he saw the badges, the files in their hands, the evidence Doyle had left behind finally delivered to people who cared. Boone tried to speak. "This is a misunderstanding. That veteran is unstable. He's been—" The lead agent cut him off with a raised hand. "Sheriff Boone, you are under federal arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, falsification of military reports, and aiding enemy forces." Boone's face drained. His hands twitched toward his belt, then stalled when one of the agents rested a hand on her holster. "Turn around, sir." Boone hesitated one last second, eyes flicking toward Grant with a kind of desperate, bitter hatred. Then he slowly placed his hands behind his back. The metal cuffs clicked shut. The sound felt final, heavy, like something that had been rotting for decades was finally being cut out of the town. The neighbors watched from their porches, wrapped in blankets, coffee mugs trembling in their hands. No one said a word. Not one person defended Boone. As the SUVs pulled away with the disgraced sheriff inside, Grant felt something unclench in his chest. The weight he'd carried since Afghanistan, the unanswered questions, the guilt, the whispers of betrayal, shedded layer by layer. It didn't vanish, not fully. Trauma never did. But the truth had a way of making scars easier to live with. Shadow nudged his hand, tail lifting just slightly. That simple gesture nearly broke him. "You did it, boy," Grant whispered. "You got us here." Shadow leaned into him as if to say the same in return. Later that morning, Megan drove Grant and Shadow to the small veterinary clinic outside Pine River. Shadow's limp worried Grant more than he admitted. The vet, a calm woman with silver hair and gentle hands, examined him thoroughly. "Bruised ribs," she confirmed. "No fractures. He'll be sore for a while, but he's tough. He'll recover." Grant let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Shadow reached up and licked his chin, as if comforting him instead. When they returned home, something unexpected waited on the porch. Wood, tools, blankets, food, even a handmade dog bed someone must have sewn in the dark of night, and people, dozens of them. Earl Matz stood awkwardly near the stairs, eyes down, boot scraping the dirt like a child being scolded. Mrs. Kent held a basket of muffins so tightly her knuckles turned white. Megan stood near the porch railing, watching Grant with a hopeful softness. Grant swallowed hard. He didn't expect this, didn't even know what to do with it. Earl was the first to step forward. "Holloway, I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "About a lot of things. We're here to help if you'll let us." Grant didn't speak. He couldn't yet. Shadow walked past him and pressed his head gently into Earl's hip. Earl flinched, then let out a shaky laugh, patting the dog carefully, like he was touching something sacred. Other neighbors stepped forward with their own apologies, some awkward, some heartfelt. A couple of the old men who had mocked him at the hardware store brought planks for a new porch. A teenager Grant had seen snickering days earlier offered to fix the windows he'd broken with a thrown rock last summer. No one mentioned PTSD. No one called him unstable. No one looked away from Shadow like he was dangerous. They saw the truth now. And in that moment, Pine River finally felt like a place Grant could breathe. Work began by afternoon. The tiny house buzzed with life. Hammering, sawdust, laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from community, not cruelty. Grant stood back and watched them rebuild a home he'd once believed was nothing more than a $1 mistake. "Maybe you should put a name on the place," Megan said as she held a plank steady for someone drilling. "Something that means what this place is becoming." Grant looked at the old porch beam, at the river flowing steady behind the house, at Shadow lying on a blanket, eyes half closed but ears alert. Then he walked to his workbench, grabbed a scrap of cedar, and carved the words slowly, carefully, each stroke a declaration. Haven House, a place where veterans could rest, could come back from the dark, could heal, a place Doyle would have been proud of. Grant hung the sign on 2 thick nails over the doorway. When he stepped back, the whole crowd fell quiet. In the soft glow of late afternoon, Haven House looked less like a joke and more like a promise. Megan wiped at her eyes. "It's perfect." Grant crouched beside Shadow, resting a hand on the dog's broad shoulder. "We made it, buddy." Shadow pressed his forehead to Grant's chest, a gesture so earnest it made Grant's throat tighten. Justice had come. Healing had begun. And for the first time in years, Grant Holloway no longer felt like a broken soldier standing on borrowed land. He felt like the keeper of something worth rebuilding. 1 year later, the house by the river didn't look anything like the broken shack Grant Holloway had bought for a single dollar. The roof was straight. The porch was sturdy. The paint, though still simple, held warm tones that caught the early evening light. But the biggest change wasn't the wood or the nails. It was the people. Haven House had become a quiet refuge for veterans passing through Pine River, a place where men and women carrying heavy stories could sit by the water, breathe freely, and share pieces of themselves without judgment. Some stayed a few days, some stayed weeks, a few never left. Grant kept a small logbook of every soul who had crossed the threshold. Names, branches of service, what they needed when they arrived, what they left behind when they moved on. Hope was the most common. Shadow greeted every veteran the same way, a slow, confident walk, a soft lean against their knee, a look that said, "I know, and you're safe here." Many broke down in tears at the simple gesture. Grant saw himself in every one of them. On a quiet summer afternoon, he walked out to the yard carrying a small wooden board he'd carved in the workshop. The river rolled lazily behind the house, catching streaks of gold from the sinking sun. Shadow padded beside him, a little grayer around the muzzle now, but stronger than he'd been the night Grant carried him to the vet. Grant knelt by the porch steps and held the board up for a moment, letting the words settle in the fading light. Shadow, the dog who opened the door to the truth. He drilled it into place just below the Haven House sign. When he stepped back, Shadow sat beside him, tail tapping once against the boards, as if giving his approval. "You earned that," Grant murmured. "Every letter." Shadow pressed his head gently against Grant's shoulder. From the road came the sound of familiar voices. Frank Brewer, the Vietnam vet who'd been the first to come after Haven House opened, walked up with two younger veterans behind him. One carried a toolbox, the other a bundle of lumber. They waved. "Evening, Grant. Need a hand with the shed?" Grant nodded. "Always." But before joining them, he placed a hand on Shadow's back and whispered, "Stay here with me a second." Shadow settled at his feet, calm, patient. Grant walked to the small tripod Megan had helped him set up near the railing. A camera stood on top, its little red light blinking. Megan had been after him for months to tell the story properly, to share what really happened so other vets and dog handlers out there, men and women isolated in their own battles, would know there was a place in the world still meant for them. Grant clicked the button. The camera blinked to life. He drew a long, steady breath. The river carried the sound. The last of the daylight brushed warm amber across his face. "If you're watching this," Grant began, "I want you to know something. A year ago, this was nothing but a broken house, and a broken man standing beside it. People laughed when I bought it. They thought I was out of my mind. And maybe I was." Behind him, Shadow looked up, ears perked at the sound of Grant's voice. "But then this dog—" Grant paused, eyes softening. "This dog found something buried beneath the floor, something the world was never supposed to see, something that told the truth." He reached down and rested a hand on Shadow's fur. "He didn't just find a safe. He saved my life." Shadow laid his head on Grant's shoe, as if proving the point. Grant continued, voice quieter now. "Haven House isn't perfect, but it's real. And for a lot of us, real is enough. We've had men from 3 different wars stay under this roof. We've had nights where the stories hurt to hear, and mornings where they healed us, all because one shepherd refused to stop searching." The sun dipped lower behind the trees. Fireflies blinked softly along the riverbank. Grant looked straight into the camera. "If you've ever had a loyal pet, a dog who stood by you when no one else would, then you already know what I'm talking about. Their courage becomes our courage. Their trust becomes our second chance." He drew in a breath, letting the weight of his final words land. "So I'll ask you this. What's your story with a loyal pet?" He reached forward and tapped the button, stopping the recording. The red light blinked off. From behind him, Frank called out, "Grant, you coming?" "Yeah," Grant answered. "Just a minute?" He turned to Shadow. Ready, partner? Shadow rose to his feet, tail wagging, the light catching in his eyes like the river catching the sun. Together, they stepped down from the porch and walked toward the veterans waiting in the yard, toward the shed that needed fixing, toward the life they had built from ashes. A dog and a man, a river, and a tiny house, a safe cracked open, and a truth finally freed, and the legacy of a shepherd who changed everything. Before you go, Grant's voice echoed in the uploaded video. If this story touched your heart, support our channel for more German Shepherd stories about courage, loyalty, and the bond that saves lives.